I want to start with a number that honestly makes no sense. 19%.
19%. What is that, like a really bad tip?
You'd think. It was the approval rating of Ohio Governor Bob Taft back in 2005.
Okay.
He was, statistically, one of the most hated governors in modern American history. And yet, that same year, he managed to pass 93% of his legislative agenda.
Wow. That's completely counterintuitive. I mean, you'd assume if the voters can't stand you, the politicians would run for the hills.
Right. We have this, this movie star idea of politics. The charismatic leader walks into a room, flashes a smile, and the laws just pass.
But the data says the exact opposite.
It suggests that popularity might actually be a trap.
It's the paradox of political capital. And, there is no better place to see this in action right now than Maryland.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're looking at Maryland's Governor Wes Moore. He's young, charismatic. People are already whispering about him for a 2028 presidential run.
And he just spent the last few months getting absolutely rolled by his own party.
Rolled might be putting it politely.
I mean, his signature bills died, his vetoes were overridden. The legislature basically reminded him who's actually in charge in the statehouse.
So today we're looking at the scorecard from the 2025 legislative session. We're going to dig into this fascinating academic framework called the policy game versus the budget game.
And we have to ask the hard question.
Is Wes Moore actually trying to govern Maryland? Or is he just auditioning for a national audience while the state runs out of money?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question.
Okay, so let's start with the facts. The session ended April 7th. Give me the headline. What actually got done?
Well, see, that's the thing. If you just look at the raw volume, the Maryland General Assembly passed over 800 bills.
So they were busy.
Incredibly busy. But if you look for the bills that Governor Moore actually put his name on, his top priorities, it's a graveyard.
Okay, be specific for me. We keep hearing he has this mandate. So what were the big casualties?
Let's start with housing. Moore introduced something called the Housing for Jobs Act. This was his big play to fix the state's housing shortage.
The idea being to, force towns to build?
Sort of. The core idea was to force local governments to approve projects if they weren't meeting certain housing targets.
So trying to overrule the whole not in my backyard crowd.
Exactly. But stopping the NMBYs means you're taking power away from local politicians. The House took one look at that, watered it down with a bunch of amendments, and it just died in a Senate committee. Never even got a final vote.
So housing reform is dead. What's next on the list?
Energy. He had the ENERGIZE Act. This was a big push to get nuclear energy classified as clean energy.
Which, seems like common sense if you want to meet your carbon goals and keep the lights on.
The laws of physics would agree with you. The green ideology, maybe not so much. The environmental lobby pushed back hard. The bill was gutted.
And then what happened?
And then, in that classic legislative move, the clock struck midnight on the final day, and poof, the bill just vanished.
It feels intentional. I mean, when a bill runs out of time, that's usually a choice by leadership, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. If the Speaker of the House wants a bill passed, they find the time. They always find the time.
So they let it die.
They let it die. And the same thing happened to his big economic package, the Decade Act, passed the Senate, but the House just ignored it.
Wow. But the biggest fight wasn't even about new laws, was it? It was about money. And Maryland is bleeding cash right now.
It was about the blueprint. Yeah. This is that massive, and I mean massive, education reform bill Maryland passed back in 2021.
Super expensive.
Incredibly expensive. So Moore looks at the state's deficit. We're talking billions of dollars. And he tried to, tap the brakes.
Wanted to cut school funding.
Well, he wanted to delay the spending increases. He proposed freezing some funding for community schools and pausing non-instructional time for teachers.
So basically telling the teachers' unions, hey, the state credit card is maxed out. Can we just wait a year?
And I'm guessing you know how the unions responded to that.
I can imagine they did not say, sure, no problem.
Not even close. The Maryland State Education Association fought back tooth and nail. Moore ended up blinking. He got a tiny compromise on the timing, but the funding basically stayed. The union took a huge victory lap.
So even when he tried to be the fiscal adult in the room, he got overpowered.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. This brings us right back to that number at the beginning. Bob Taft, 19% approval, gets everything. Wes Moore, 52%, which is pretty decent, gets nothing. Why?
So to understand this, you really have to look at this book called The Power of American Governors. The authors, Kusser and Phillips, they argue that governors aren't playing one game. They're playing two totally different games with completely different rules.
Okay, break them down for me. What's game one?
Game one is the policy game. This is about passing your general laws, housing rules, energy standards, stuff like that. In this game, the legislature holds a monopoly.
A monopoly. That sounds a little extreme.
But think about it. If the governor sends down a bill to change housing rules and the legislature does nothing, what happens?
Nothing. The old laws just stay in place, the status quo.
Exactly. The status quo remains. And for a lot of legislators, the status quo is fine. They don't need to pass the governor's bill to keep their jobs. So the governor has almost zero leverage.
He has to sort of convince them.
He has to buy their cooperation with his popularity or with political favors. But in a state like Maryland, where most of the legislators are in super safe districts, they can just wait him out.
And that's why Moore lost on housing and energy. They just didn't have to act.
He couldn't force them.
Right. Okay, so that's the policy game. What's game two?
The budget game. And this is completely different because in this game, doing nothing is not an option.
Because if you do nothing, the government shuts down.
Exactly. If a budget isn't passed by July 1st, cops don't get paid, state parks close, schools panic. It's a complete catastrophe. So someone has to blink. It's a staring contest.
And who usually wins a staring contest?
The person with the most patience. And in state government, that's usually the governor. He's there full time. A lot of the legislators are part-time. They have other jobs. They want to go home to their families.
So the governor can just wait them out.
Until the absolute last second. And that's why Moore got a budget deal passed, even though he lost on pretty much everything else.
Because the legislature had to pass the budget.
They had to, but they did not have to pass his nuclear energy bill. And Moore is learning that all his charisma, his TV appearances, it's basically worthless in the policy game if the legislative leadership just decides to cross its arms and say no.
You mentioned leadership. It seems like this isn't just some abstract theory. There's real friction here between Moore and specifically the Senate President, Bill Ferguson.
It seems very personal. And it really comes down to a clash of motivations. You have Moore, who seems to be looking at the national stage, and then you have Ferguson, who's looking at the Maryland legal code.
Okay, give us the best example of that. I heard about a redistricting fight.
Right. So Moore wanted to call a special session to redraw Maryland's congressional maps.
And the goal was pretty obvious, right? To help the National Democratic Party.
Counter the Republican maps in other states, help win back the House. It's standard partisan politics. They do it, so we should do it.
But Ferguson said no.
Flat out refused to call the session. He looked at the court precedents in Maryland, which are actually very strict against gerrymandering, and he basically said the legal risks were too high and the potential downside was catastrophic.
In other words, I'm not going to waste taxpayer money on a new map that the courts are just going to throw out in 3 months.
That's it, exactly. And the phrase that kept popping up in our sources about Ferguson was that he was acting as the adult in the room.
Oof, it's going to sting if you're the governor.
It's a brutal framing. It makes Moore look like the impulsive one chasing headlines, while the legislature is the responsible parent holding the car keys.
And they're not just blocking him, they're actively overriding him.
The veto overrides this session were a huge deal. That's a total sign of a breakdown in the relationship.
What were they?
Moore vetoed a bill to create a reparations commission. He argued they'd already studied the issue enough. They overrode him. He vetoed a study on data centers. Overrode him again.
Overriding a veto is like the ultimate we don't respect you move in state politics.
It is, and it points to what some insiders are calling his weak tentacles.
Weak tentacles.
It's jargon for his inside political network. One Democratic strategist said that Moore's internal political operation is surprisingly weak. He just doesn't know how to whip votes. He's an outsider in a building that's run by insiders.
Okay, let's talk about the money again, because this deficit seems to be the dark cloud hanging over all of this. How bad is the hole Maryland is in?
It's structural, and that's the scary word. We're not talking about a one-time shortfall. We are looking at a projected deficit of somewhere between $1.4 billion and $3 billion.
And you can't blame that on a recession because the economy is, on paper, growing.
Exactly. State Senator Steve Hershey, he's a Republican, he pointed this out. He said, these deficits didn't appear overnight. This is the result of years of adding these huge spending programs like the blueprint without adding the revenue to pay for them.
It's just simple math.
You can't spend what you don't have.
Which just massive amounts of electricity. And this is where the policies collide, right? Moore is inviting these power-hungry companies in, but his own party is blocking the energy sources needed to run them.
This goes right back to that nuclear bill failing.
So data centers need what's called baseload power. Can you just explain that for us non-engineers?
Sure, think of it like the foundation of a house. It has to be there, solid, 24/7. Solar and wind, they're like the decorations. They're great when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing.
But you can't run a server farm on power that disappears when a cloud goes by.
You can't. You need nuclear or natural gas. So the legislature kills the nuclear bill, but then they turn around and demand a study on the environmental impact of the data centers.
They even forced a moratorium, right? A pause on building them.
In some areas, yes. A Baltimore County councilman, Pat Young, introduced legislation to pause them, and the state legislature overrode Moore's veto to force a $500,000 environmental study.
So Moore is saying, come to Maryland, bring your jobs and tax dollars. And the legislature is saying, not so fast. We need to study your carbon footprint first.
And meanwhile, the grid is straining. So Moore is writing letters to PJM.
Another acronym. Who's PJM?
Think of PJM as the air traffic control for the electric grid. They manage the flow of power across a bunch of states. Moore is asking them to cap energy prices.
But critics are pointing out that you can't kill nuclear, invite data centers, and then complain that electricity is getting expensive.
It's magical thinking. It's a supply and demand problem that the state itself created.
So they want the tax revenue from the data centers, but they don't want the, quote, icky power plants you need to actually run them.
Exactly. And the result is higher energy bills for regular families.
I want to circle back to the politics of this because Moore's approval rating has dropped. He was up at 64%. Now he's at 52%.
Which is still a majority, for sure, but the trend line is definitely going the wrong way.
So let's go back to that Cuser and Phillips theory. They argue that sometimes popular governors, especially the ones with national ambitions, they engage in something called position taking. Explain what that is.
This is sort of the cynical part of the game. If you're planning to run for president in 2028, you don't actually need to pass a housing bill in Maryland.
You just need to be seen fighting for housing.
The narrative matters more than the result. Exactly. If the bill fails, you can blame the entrenched system or the do-nothing legislature. You get to play the martyr.
And you see this in his rhetoric.
Oh, absolutely. In his State of the State address, he spent a big chunk of time attacking Donald Trump.
Which, if you're the governor of Maryland dealing with a massive state deficit, feels a little disconnected from the job.
It's deflection. He blamed the federal government for a sewage spill in the Potomac. But meanwhile, back home, his administration is dealing with these huge operational failures.
Like what?
The Department of Juvenile Services lost track of a teenager who then went on to commit 2 murders. A child died in foster care under the Department of Human Services.
That's the boring stuff of governing. Management. The plumbing.
It is. But voters notice when the plumbing breaks. And that drop in the polls suggests that Marylanders are getting tired of the national rhetoric. There was a great quote from a resident in our sources. Marylanders don't want headlines, they want results.
So does Moore actually want these bills to pass? Or is the conflict the whole point?
That is the big question. If he passes a budget that has to cut education, he angers the unions, a key part of his base for a presidential run.
But if he fights the legislature and loses?
He keeps his hands clean. He can say, look, I tried to save the budget, but they wouldn't let me.
Okay, so what's the verdict here? Is charisma a liability?
I don't know if it's a liability, but it is definitely not a magic wand. Moore is finding out that the policy game requires grinding, boring work.
Building coalitions, counting votes.
Making unsexy compromises. You can't just smile your way through a $3 billion structural deficit.
And the legislature knows they hold the cards.
They do. They're the parents with the car keys. And until Moore realizes he needs to negotiate with them, instead of just performing for the cameras, he's going to keep running into these exact same walls.
It's going to be a fascinating budget season next year. We will see who blinks first. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.